I'm Amy Saxton. I'm the CEO of Summer Search, and I'm really delighted to be here with you this morning. As Amanda and Lisa mentioned, one of the most exciting developments that I'm seeing in the national dialogue is the recognition that grit, tenacity, character, whatever you want to call it, is hugely important to education and life success. We are in for a real treat today. And in this next panel, we're going to hear about the context that I think we all could benefit from to develop solutions for scaling grit and resilience in our kids. So to Philadelphia Academies, City Foundation, Philadelphia University, all of you here, our Summer Search team, thank you for doubling down and rolling up our sleeves today to talk about how we can better support our students, particularly our kids of color. So I am so delighted to introduce Micah Scott. She's going to facilitate today's panel. Micah is WHYY's behavioral health reporter, has been part of that team since 1997. She's been honored with the prestigious Gracie Allen Award for her work. She recently, I'm going to put in a little plug if you don't mind. She recently became host of The Pulse. If you haven't heard it yet, it airs on Fridays at 9 a.m. about stories about health, science, and innovation. And full disclosure, we were honored to have Micah interview our ED, Amanda Jefferson, and Angela Duckworth very recently. So please join me in welcoming Micah and Scott and our panelists today.
I think everybody's coming up. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. This is a topic that I have long been interested in, and I saw the topic of resilience come up about 10 or 12 years ago. It seemed like a lot of people were interested in it, were talking about it. Then it seemed to kind of fade away, and I'm really glad that right now, once again, that kind of work is on the forefront, and it seems people are very interested in this issue of how do we make our children resilient. So the first thing I'm going to do is not much. I'm going to let our panelists talk. They have their order. They're going to introduce themselves. Lori is first. We're going to hear from Dr. Lori Shore, then Dr. Angela Duckworth, then Dr. Rich Roberts, and then Sarah Singer. So they will each introduce themselves briefly, talk for a few minutes, and then we're going to have some questions, and then we're going to give you the opportunity to ask them some questions as well. So go for it. Dr. Shore, you're first.
Hi. Good morning. I'm Lori Shore, Mayor Nutter's Chief Education Officer. Is this the part where we do our 5 minutes, or is
Yes.
that? Okay. I didn't want to get us off on the wrong foot right from the very beginning. So, part of my job this morning is to give you some context. And I've got to say, I'm going to give you a lot of some facts and figures. After seeing that video, it feels a little bit cold and removed from what kids are facing every day, but I think we need to have both parts of the equation so that we can understand as adults and as leaders in this sphere what we need to be able to do. So one of the things I was asked to talk about, and I'm going to just do this briefly because we can all chime in on this, is the achievement gap in Philadelphia. And Amy alluded to some of the statistics that we track and are looking at in this city. Particularly the graduation rate is something that as a city, since this mayor has taken office, we've really been pushing on. There's actually good news here in that we've increased the graduation rate by 11% since '08. So I think if you were to read the headlines, you wouldn't think there was any good things happening in this city, but we actually have seen an increase in the graduation rate. And another piece of good news is actually African-American males and Hispanic or Latino males have outpaced the average in terms of those gains. So it's not like the gain of the 11% that we saw was made up by a subgroup of kids who have always done well in the system. We're actually seeing the subgroups that have had the hardest time in our education system making a little bit better of a gain. So they're at 12 and 13%. Not anything to really write home about yet because the gap is still so large. So African American males, 45% graduate from when 45% of ninth graders go on to graduate from high school in 4 or 6 years, even if you give them the extra 2 years. And for Latino males, it's at 39, which is the subgroup that has the least positive results. So when we look at if our systems are failing, we look at these subgroups because they're the ones who are the most disenfranchised from the sort of schooling that we have traditionally supplied for our kids in the city. Our college graduation rate, as you know, or maybe you don't, I live it every day, so I think everybody like has this stuff tattooed on their arm. We're at 24.3% of the population in the city has either a 2 or 4-year degree. That puts us 92nd out of the 100 of the large cities in terms of the amount of folks we have who have been successful through that whole pipeline. And when I talk about pipeline, you can go all the way back to pre-K, but we look at 9th graders. If we have 100 9th graders, about, as we were saying, like 64 of them graduate from high school, but then we lose almost the exact same portion of them, a little bit less, through college. So we also have to be looking at what's happening at the college level to get people through. I mean, college, at least when I went, it was look to your left, look to your right. One of you are going to be here at the end. In other words, sort of, it's up to you, and part of our job as the university is to get some of you to leave. We're creaming, and we're very clear about that. Trying to change that conversation at the university level to look to your left, look to your right. These are the people that you have to move through with. Let us know, what sort of support you need. That's a huge culture change in an institution that's been around like since the medieval times and isn't real keen on doing fast-paced change. I don't know how many of you work in the university setting, but it's not exactly turning on the dime sort of institution. I worked there for many, many years, so I feel that I have the right to critique it a little bit. When we look at some of the outcomes in terms of academics, we always fall back on the PSSA, which is the state test that tells us something about how schools are doing. It's less effective on the kid level because it's not diagnostic, but it does correlate highly, I should say, using my hat when I was at the state. It really does correlate highly with whether you're ready for college, to be successful in college. It correlates as highly, I should say, as the SAT does. That being said, not a great correlation there. And some of the things that we found when we were at Temple, we had do a freshman survey. And what we found in the freshman survey at Temple was that the questions around resiliency were actually they correlated more highly to people who were successful in getting their degree than either socioeconomic class or their SAT score coming in. So there's something to be said about, and I think we're going to say a lot about it today, that it's the will to succeed and overcome the multiple barriers that get in your way that, at least at Temple, was indicative about whether or not you would be successful at the end of the day. But just to put the facts out there for you in terms of the PSSA, we still have a big gap between the performance of African American and Hispanic students compared to white and Asian students. So if you look at the PSSAs, you know what, I'm just going to say it's about double. I'm not going to give you all the facts and figures. If you look at how Latino and African American students are doing, they're doing about half as well in the PSSAs as the other group that I described. So so you're looking at about, we're at proficient at advanced for math and reading at about 67 and 60% if you look at elementary school, but for subgroups for African American or Hispanic, you're looking at 38, 36% in that area. So we don't have to go into like the nitty gritty of the percentage points, but just letting you know that gap still exists. The gap around economic disadvantaged students is equally troubling. And when you look at the population of the district overall, we're at 52% African American, 20% Hispanic, 14% Caucasian, and 87% economic disadvantage. So I was asked to sort of put that out there to let you know where we are as a city, and to talk, this is the part I think I can't get done in 5 minutes, about the causes. I mean, and in fact, I don't have 5 minutes, I have 1 minute. So here's what I would say. Money does matter. School district and charters are looking for $320 million next year. We don't have a state funding formula. Every good idea practically needs money. So we've got to focus some on that. But I would say the other thing that we don't talk enough about is we need to develop new types of schooling that really honor the complexities of the kids who come into our buildings and keep up with the times. I mean, our schools should not look like Little House on the Prairie just with an updated fashion sense, right? They should look dramatically different, given that the way knowledge is produced now is dramatically different than how it was produced back in the day. And I walk into too many classrooms where teaching is going on exactly the same as it did 100 years ago. And our students are too bright and too connected to the real world to find that compelling or engaging. And when they're having to overcome the obstacles sometimes that they have to, and they're using their grit and resilience to get there and to engage, and then they find those sort of classrooms. So I'm putting that out as a challenge to everybody who works with kids, that you've got to be thinking about that. And then I think the last thing is we've got to listen to the communities where our schools, where our kids come from, and hear from them about where the disconnect is and how to build resilience in their children, because they're their children and they know a little bit more about them and what makes them tick than we do. So I was a parent of a school district kid, and two, in fact, and I know that it was important for me to be able to have a say in how that education happened, and I think that that's a key part going forward. I don't know who's next.
Yeah.
Rich. Hi, it's so great to be here. I really want to thank you guys, and it's a room of the usual suspects, which is great. I guess I'll try to speak for 5 minutes on grit. It's actually kind of hard for me. Let's see. And I sort of feel like I'm preaching to the converted. I don't know whether I want to tell you that grit predicts a lot of good things in life. Maybe I'll just say that. It does. It predicts a lot of good things in life, like, you know, graduating from places that a lot of other people don't graduate from. I'll give you one statistic. I love those statistics. I was like, oh, numbers, it's great. So in the Chicago public schools a few years ago, they decided to give the grit scale, an abbreviated version of the grit scale, to all of the high school juniors, among a gajillion other scales. And then, of course, we had standardized test scores and grades and all the other things that public schools capture regularly about their kids. And in terms of the psychological stuff that was given, these questionnaires, grit was the best predictor, at least from all the data that we could look at, of who would actually graduate on time, you know, over a year later. And that is controlling for standardized test scores. I do want to say one other thing about the predictive power of grit, because, well, since we're all the converted, and actually many of you are preachers, I think it's just important to know that it's not that grit statistically always predicts things better than IQ or test scores or GPA. But I think the important lesson, because sometimes it does, like at West Point, it outpredicts everything in terms of whether you're going to graduate from West Point 4 years after you start, and so at least everything that I can see in my own data set. But I think the real lesson is that it's not the same thing as, you know, your IQ, your SAT score, or so forth. So it predicts what we would say over and beyond, or kind of like, all right, you can predict a lot from these traditional variables, but you can't predict everything. And some of these other factors, call it grit, call it resilience, call it character. Nobody can agree about these words, so I don't know if we should try. But it predicts over and beyond. In other words, it's capturing something else. So that's the only thing I'll say about predictions. I guess let's move right on to like where I am thinking about intervention. So the first thing I will say is that, you know, human nature is so darn complicated, and these kids' lives are so complicated, like all of our lives are. You know, it's not going to be one good idea. It's not going to be growth mindset, period. You know, it's not just going to be like, oh, having a mentor who unconditionally supports you. It's both of those things, but then it's got to be a lot of other things. I mean, the only thing I will say about the solution to improving grit and resilience is it's not going to be a single thing. Different kids give up for different reasons. And when you see a kid who's actually not giving up and who is thriving despite adversity, it's like the Tolstoy quote, you know, every unhappy family is alike. Every happy family is alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way. There are many different paths to dropping out, and different kids drop out for different reasons. So I guess just to say at the beginning, I don't think it's going to be any simple little flow chart. It's going to be a really complicated thing with different arrows, and, you know, that arrow works for that kid, and this kid has these 3 arrows, and those are not the same 3 arrows as that kid. Now, what do we know from research? I will say that growth mindset, the deep down belief that human nature is malleable, that things that you think might be fixed about someone, like their personality or their intelligence, actually that people change, that somebody that you see is terrible at gym class, like I was, isn't such a terrible athlete when they grow up, like I'm not that bad right now, that somebody who really struggles and maybe even gets a D in math in 4th grade, you never know. That kid actually might, complete algebra, and oh my God, that kid might be able to do calculus when they're in high school. Carol Dweck's idea of growth mindset is deeply, about human nature and a belief that either people do or don't change. That's correlated with grit at about R.3. In other words, kids who have a grittier sort of disposition and who persevere despite setbacks towards a challenging, far-off goal that could take them years, if not decades, to achieve, they tend to be the kids with growth mindset. But it's not the only thing. So growth mindset's a great idea, and you can change it by just convincing kids, essentially, with scientific evidence and some other techniques of persuasion, that actually the brain does grow, neurons make new connections, people change. So that's one direction and one great idea. The second idea that we're working on in our lab is another kind of belief. Not the belief that human nature can change, but a different belief, which is the idea of practice and just the relative importance of practice to talent. So some kids might believe, practice matters. Talent also matters, but talent matters a lot more than practice does. And I was watching the Oscars on Sunday night, some of you may have as well, and it's like talent just rolls off our lips. It's like, I can't believe the talent here tonight. Well, there's so many talented young women in Hollywood, and there's talented black people too, and there's talented, men, and, so I think that kids get reinforced with this message with, are you or are you not in the gifted and talented program? What level were you placed into? Are you in the advanced level or are you in the remedial level? They're so kind of drilled in the idea that these native differences and how quickly you learn determine so much in life, and then there's a little bit of role there for practice. Whereas the scientific evidence suggests just the opposite, which is that, sure, there are differences in how quickly people learn, but we're really similar in the ability overall as human beings to adapt and to improve. So maybe we have to flip the emphasis and to say, there's some role for talent, but wow, so much of life, so much of it is practice, feedback, failing, and getting better. So we have interventions that we're targeting particularly at adolescents because we think that's the most important developmental sort of inflection point, as was mentioned earlier, and trying to change kids' beliefs about the relative importance of practice versus talent, and then also the kinds of practice that actually get you better, which is a high failure, high effort, high concentration, this is no fun kind of practice. And I guess I'll just end with this last thing, because I'm I was writing a paper on this until 1 a.m. last night. When you ask the question, where does grit really come from, and how do we describe gritty people? And as I said, it's not one thing; it's many things. The last thing I'll just say is that I think a lot of times gritty people say things, you can hear them say it under their breath or out loud. I want to be the kind of person who, I'm the kind of person who, when I miss the bus, I walk to school. I'm the kind of person who, you block this path, I'll find another path. Shaun White, I'll end with this little anecdote. I know he didn't medal, but he's still really good at what he does. So he was in the New York Times Magazine, there's a little profile of him, and he was coming off of a run, and he was watching the videotape, which is what, hard practice looks like. Get feedback from what you did, look at your mistakes, try to get better. And the interviewer asked him, well, you're actually not as good at this kind of thing that you're doing, this kind of snowboarding, why are you doing it? And he said, I'm the kind of person, I want to be the kind of person who doesn't give up on what they start. So I'll just leave with that, maybe that idea of, in addition to growth mindset, and in addition to changing different beliefs and the many other things, and a mentor, et cetera, it would be terrific if our kids walked around saying, I'm the kind of person who, I'm the kind of person who, when stuff happens, I figure out a way. So I think this identity question of sort of this very self-conscious, one of the ways to get kids to be grittier is just to have them think of themselves as gritty people. And, what do gritty people do? And that's the kind of person I want to be, and that's the kind of person I am. So I'll end there and pass the microphone to the next person, who is...
I'm going to go up there.
All right.
I got some things to show you. Welcome. I'm, believe it or not, a Center City, Philadelphia. Funny accent, huh? So I want to talk a little bit about something we've actually developed at the Educational Testing Service. You won't believe that the Educational Testing Service has even developed this, right, Lisa? It's kind of incredible. But it's a tale of something called the Mission Skills Assessment. You all know what a mission statement is, correct? How many schools have very elaborate mission statements? Most. How many of them actually assess for those mission statements? None, or virtually none. That's changed. So I'm going to tell you very quickly about a project that I've been involved in where explicitly we've set out to evaluate the mission statements of schools. And if you look at it, it's what makes this a really cool study. We're doing what's called a longitudinal design. So we measure these things for many, many years over the course of a student's actual school life. And I'm going to focus today a little bit on resilience. Angela pointed out it goes under by all sorts of other names. I like to think of it as work ethic. It involves effective organization all the time. It doesn't really matter. Here's the story. Here's what this makes this really interesting. We don't use one methodology. We think that one methodology, whether we ask you a self-report, you're a good person, are you? Yes, I hope so. But do you know that? Do we all believe that? So the way that we do this is we ask people assessments about themselves and get them to self-evaluate. We also get them to do tasks that have a scenario basis to them, and then they actually have to sit down and answer the questions on the scenario-based task. And then we get the teachers to also report on them, on these various dimensions. We know that each one of these methods by themselves, they're not good. But guess what? If you actually put them all together, you triangulate them, and you do some really statistical model. It's called a really I'm a nerdy scientist. Do you want to hear the technical name? Multi-trait, multi-method, longitudinal research design. If you do that, you get at a very effective measure of the constructs, okay? So we've been doing this in now 68 schools, 12,600 plus students around the nation. Philadelphia not so well represented, but we'll aim to change that, right? Who's up for changing that? Here's just some really interesting research around this attempt to really measure this much more precisely, I think, than anyone has in the past. We can make this as reliable. The reliability of the SAT, by the way, that's whether, how you can give it to you one time and give it to you again. It's 0.91. Guess what these are? 0.91. Cool, huh? So it's about the same reliability as the SAT. And there's some noteworthy trends. Because we've got a longitudinal design, what I like about longitudinal designs, you actually can make causal inferences. I can actually start to say, hey, this is causing that. Here's a really sad story. Girls are better on all of the non-cognitive skills than boys. It's a trend that we're even seeing in large-scale longitudinal assessments. It's a worrying trend if you're a male. Here's something else. Without any interventions, we've measured this across all the schools, neither grit nor resilience improve. That is a terrible, terrible story for an educator. Really is. We know, as Angela has pointed out in a lot of her research, and we do some of this stuff too, grit relates to GPA about the same extent as standardized cognitive test scores. But resilience isn't quite so high. But here's where it gets interesting. Grit and resilience predict a range of valued outcomes. I find this, don't worry about it, I'm just going to show you that graph because it shows that I'm a scientist, right? What's interesting about this is what it's really showing is that boys benefit from resilience more than girls, which I think is really interesting, from being highly resilient, much more so than girls. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so I'm a nerdy scientist, but here's what's really interesting about this whole thing. The schools started to take these assessments seriously. Isn't it funny? Why do schools focus so much on cognitive skills, do you think? Because there's an end goal. There's an assessment at the end that you've got to push them through. Imagine that what you're doing here is what we're doing. You're actually setting up to make these an important way that the schools are being compared. So guess what happened? The schools started to do things about it. This, to me, is the most effective intervention in the world. So what they're doing now, they send out monthly letters about the various skills. They explain it to the parents. They get teachers to actually teach the test. Hey, I'm from the Educational Testing Service, but for this, I love it. Teach to the test. It's fantastic. Teach people grit. Teach them resilience. They start to develop standardized rubrics to evaluate their kids. They're now starting to inculcate this into education programs, and they're also we have started to even develop curricula. So I've shown some of this to Lisa one time, where we actually go in and we develop curricula to improve someone's time management skills, which are actually an important component of grit in the end. Isn't that cool? That's my story. I'm sticking to it. Thank you. That's all the stuff. Okay? No worries. Thanks, mate. Oh, jeez.
All right. And now we have Sarah. Do you want to be here? Do you want to be there? You're going to be there too.
Oh, actually, I'm going to sit over there. It's impossible to see that.
That's grit, right?
Sorry, guys. I can't help but show a few slides too. So I'm going to talk a little bit, kind of take us in a different direction, talk a little bit about specifically kind of the assets and resources in the college access and success system in Philadelphia, drawing on kind of two different reports that we'd done. One was a landscape study for the Knight Foundation, another was the Pathways to Completion report that we did in partnership with the mayor's office. So I'm going to kind of fly through these first two slides. It's really kind of reiterating a lot of the points we've already heard about the fact that students are not getting to and through college enough. And that there are kind of multiple challenge points for students. And these are kind of points that in 2010, 2011, when we were producing these reports, were kind of new, were eye-opening, were not necessarily as kind of commonly known as they are today. And I think that's one of the really positive changes, is that these kind of data are more widely understood. And certainly we've seen in Philadelphia the conversation begin to shift from just access to access and completion. So in 2010, we actually kind of mapped out who were the various stakeholders in the Philadelphia community. A lot of folks who are in the room were reflected in that, that diagram, but there are certainly kind of new folks who would be added to this at this point. But what we found was that there were a lot of supports in Philadelphia, kind of directly supporting students around college access specifically, but college access and success. And that in the green, there was also this kind of broader network of players that were that were kind of supporting college access and success at a system level, invested in this issue, whether through fundraising, financial support, policy, research, et cetera. So the bottom line was that this was a community with a lot of assets and a lot of resources to build on. So between 2010 and 2014, there's been a lot of flux in the system. And there's a lot of changes, but there are some fundamentals that have stayed the same. So the mayor's office in 2010 was still kind of a new office. The mayor's council on college and career success was new. And they were really kind of focused generally on alignment of, and coordination of these kind of multiple resources throughout the city. In 2014, we see kind of more targeted and strategic work that they're engaging in on the college access side. Philly Goes to College, on the college completion side, convening higher education partners from across the city, and these are just a couple examples. There's been an expansion of 2010 assets. So we saw some high-performing charters like KIPP and Mastery that were focusing on college, really kind of getting a foothold in the city in 2010. There were a lot of organizations with a college access and success specific focus already operating in 2010. And you had organizations like Philadelphia College Prep Roundtable, which were working across organizations. In 2014, you just see more of this. You see folks kind of expanding focus, increasing numbers, new players being engaged and involved. You also see new collaborations. So there were multiple kind of tables and collaborations in 2010, and we see more in 2014, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the School District of Philadelphia. In 2010, there were a number of offices that were supporting college access and success, not the least of which was the Office of College and Career Awareness. But certainly the flux in the district, the financial crisis, there's been a sense that college access and success has kind of been pushed to the back burner in the last few years. With that said, the recent action plan that was released in February, just a few weeks ago, highlights college readiness as one of 4 anchor goals in the new plan. So, we'll see kind of how things progress. So in 2010, our assessment was that there were a lot of organizations, and there was kind of this emerging focus and alignment and coordination. So you'd had tables where people were coming together, but there was really kind of an explicit interest in kind of aligning and coordinating supports across folks, and certainly the Mayor's Council was a huge part of that. And in 2010, we see that there are more tables, there are more collaborations, but that there's a sense that we're kind of operating in this environment of not just siloed organizations, but also siloed collaboratives. That assets aren't kind of necessarily building on and off of one another, and that there's a lot of opportunity here. There's a ton of educational leadership around specifically issues of college access and success, but we're maybe not getting as far as we could because these pieces aren't connecting. So where does that leave us? That leaves us kind of operating with a lot of dispersed assets, and it raises this question, are we kind of crowding certain spaces but leaving deserts elsewhere? There's a growing focus on college completion, but it's still nascent. So especially at the higher ed level, driven in part by national conversations, completion has been a really large focus. But it's not just up to higher ed. We have to be thinking as a community about how we reach back and stretch forward to expand a completion focus. So what does a completion focus look like in high school? And how do we need to kind of think about what supports we provide for students differently? And on the other hand, how do higher education partners kind of reach back into the K-12 years to help support that work? And then lastly, that there's a lot of collaboration, but there's little collective impact. And that we need to kind of think about and answer this question: where is the right place to center a community-wide post-secondary completion agenda? We have a lot of great work happening in this city and a lot of pieces, but how they all fit together and who kind of manages them continuing to fit together is a question. So thanks.
All right, everybody, return to your seats. We're going to chat for just a few moments, and then we're going to open things up because we have to also try to make up for some lost time, right? So we'll try to move quickly through some questions. Ooh, that was a lot of information. It's kind of hard to digest everything that was said. So I wanted to ask a few follow-up questions. And something that came to my mind as all of you were talking, the other huge kind of stream of discussion I see happening right now, there's one big stream talking about grit, and another big stream of teachers and social service providers are talking about something called adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. How many of you have heard of the ACE study? Right, it's basically tracking the lifelong impact of adverse childhood experiences, and I think it's changing public health, it's changing education on many levels, and it seems like you two are related, but you're not really touching, and I'm wondering about the impact of adverse childhood experience on grit. If we have to exhibit a lot of grit over the course of our lives, do we get better at it? Or do we have kind of grit fatigue because by the time we're 10, we've already been grittier than other people have, reaching 70. So what are your thoughts on that, and how does that impact grit? Angela.
I'll go after you if you like. Okay, so here's one issue about that. I always think it's interesting that the federal government is starting to get very interested in non-cognitive assessment. They are. If you ask questions, though, about affect and things that are related to negative experiences, they'll run away in education, I can assure you of that. NAEP has some very strong guidelines about the kind of wording and verbiage that you could use. Mm-hmm. So that's going to force linking those two together to be kind of difficult. So it's an unfortunate story, but where I think we're at the moment, at least with the federal government and how it could impact this. If you were a school, could you do it? Again, you'd be worried about some of the reactions that parents would have when you start asking these kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot of logistical and ethical issues around trying, I think, to get these two linked. It's not that I don't think they're both important, it's just going to be difficult.
Mm-hmm. So you guys don't have any data on it yet? So
we run into the problem, quite honestly, that people can't ask these types of questions.
Right. Nietzsche said, before Kelly Clarkson, that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Somebody should tell Kelly Clarkson that Nietzsche said. Well, they also, it's a good line. But so it's an interesting hypothesis. Either what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or it just kills you. I mean, nobody really knows. I think the research on grit is not much. Like, I just got my PhD, like not that long ago. And of course, people study related constructs like resilience and so forth. But I will just say that I don't think it's known. There's a hypothesis that, maybe the right dosage and in the right time and with the right support, that high challenge can make you stronger. That sounds to me like a really great hypothesis, but as Rich said, there's not a lot of data. I will say something that I do have data on. So half of my lab actually studies self-control, which is not the same thing as grit, but it's very correlated, and it's sort of obviously related. Self-control is being able to resist temptation and distractions in a moment, right? Like, oh, right now it would feel really good to eat that donut. I'm going to immediately regret it. Do I eat the donut or do I not? Grit is about in the long term, not in the moment, but over years and even longer, sticking with this goal through thick and thin. So they are related, but let me just say, there's lots of data on self-control. It is possibly the best studied construct in all of psychology today, other than maybe intelligence. And here's what we know about adverse childhood experiences and self-control. If you count up the number of negative life events in a kid's life at time 1, right, and then you measure their psychological state, their anxiety, their feelings of helplessness, their feelings of worry, rumination, and so forth at time 2, and then you measure their self-control at time 3, what you can do is you can predict the number of negative life events at time 1 predicts higher levels of being stressed out, anxious, feeling helpless at time 2, and that predicts decreases in self-control at time 3, controlling for how they started. So the idea that, these negative life events could in some ways be positive is tantalizing, but I think the data that we have right now is that they're bad. They tend to make kids, I think, more impulsive, because when you live in an environment where the future is uncertain, you're not sure who to trust, and you're feeling threatened, I think the adaptive, rational thing would be just to be impulsive and short-sighted and so forth. I think that's what we're seeing.
So are we adjusting then how we teach grit to kids depending on who the kids are? I mean, kids face, as you said, kids face completely different circumstances. So is that being taken into account as we try to teach kids grit? And how can we take that into account?
I mean, I'm imagining it's not taken to it. Actually, we interviewed some of the teachers in these, every data set that I collect with those variables in it, you get the same pattern. But when you interview the teachers, often they don't even know. So they can tell you that a kid is falling apart in their classroom. Mm-hmm. Often they don't even know that the upstream thing of that is like, dad just lost his job, my parents are fighting, my best friend moved away, somebody that I know got shot, So I don't know that teachers even know that these things are actually upstream from what they're seeing in the classroom. And even if they did know, I think the unfortunate situation from my point of view, but I'd love to hear otherwise, is that even if I did know, it's not that I have, okay, well, I'll turn to page 42 and, teach you this way. So, so there's a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I would add to that is, because we know some of the things that you were talking about, what does that mean in terms of how we provide care from the city in terms of Department of Human Services, behavioral health, and schools? So it has been very difficult to exchange data and to let teachers know that the kid in your classroom has a social worker, you should be in touch with that social worker, you and the social worker should be working together. We were fortunate, and Cynthia was here a second ago, but we were fortunate about 3 years ago through Herculean efforts that I couldn't even begin to describe to you, to get an MOU signed between the city and the school district so that sort of information could be shared. That being said, it's very difficult to implement that and to make that part of both of those professionals' belief that it's part of their mission of what they should be doing. Because the teacher thinks they need to be teaching, they know this kid is falling apart, they see it, they want to do something, but it's not exactly in their job description. Same thing with our social workers. They know that educational attainment is an important indicator about how a kid is doing and what their life outcomes will be, do they take extra time out of their day to touch base with that teacher? So it's really about having a more holistic idea of what it means to learn and grow, and to have the conversations about, like, are we, both you teacher and me social worker and mom or dad or family, are we all telling this kid, look, you may be struggling now, but your brain can develop, and later on you could be doing really great in this subject. You know, it's that sort of collaborative work between school, family, and social worker, if they're there, that I think would have a possibility. Just getting those big bureaucracies to work together in a way that's nimble enough that it doesn't crush a kid but helps a kid is the challenge.
Sorry, Sarah?
I'll just.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, because I don't think I can project enough. So the thing that I would add is also, Rich talked about some of the challenges in connecting these things in terms of the federal government or even a school district level, but it raises a question for me in terms of what is the role of kind of the nonprofit community potentially in helping to support some of those connections. And on Lori's point, thinking about what is the role of us, one another, to kind of influence one another's actions, think about kind of this from a systems change perspective, right? Not just how we're doing this with our individual students, how we provide models for others, how we kind of help make those connections across one another.
How is this message being communicated to parents? Parents are very important to educators, to anybody. So are they in on this? And maybe not just parents. You mentioned, a big predictor of success in life is having an adult in your life who cares about you. So how can I be that adult to a kid? What do I need to know? And is that message being communicated?
Yeah, I mean, we're not communicating because we're a testing service, you see. But what happened was when we built this mission skills assessment, most of the headmasters, what do you call them? Principals. Sorry, I'm not really Philadelphian. Most of the principals actually went out and started writing letters to the parents. And here's what was really interesting in our experience too: the kids loved the assessment. They absolutely love doing these non-cognitive things. So we heard them going around the school going, hey, I wish we did more of this in school. Very, very interesting, because then I think the parents, they're going to go back home and tell the parents that they did it.
Do they get their feedback? Do they get their scores?
They can get their feedback. It's up to the schools. They're using it a little bit differently. So we have different models. Sometimes you can get feedback to the kids. We've built systems where you can build feedback for the kids, to the parents, to the school administrators, all different levels. So, that's how I see it happening. You write specifically letters, and then the school even has parent nights, focusing on these 6 things that we have.
Okay.
So I'm going to take off my mayoral hat and put on my parent hat. My child 2 weeks ago came home from school, and one of his homework assignments was to watch Angela Duckworth's TED Talk. And
I hope that doesn't happen to my kid.
He had to watch it once by himself, and then he had to watch it once with a parent, and we had to talk about it. And
wow.
so that's like not a paper, it's going online, seeing somebody talk. He was engaged, he's 12, so he could understand what was being said. We talked about that in relationship to soccer playing, because that's what really engages him. And then I carefully moved it into math, trying not to lose him along the way. I think that, after a certain age, kids can understand these concepts that you're not just born with a certain amount of smart, that, practice effort equals ability, which is what we talk about in our household, and just getting kids to understand that and getting parents to understand that, because I think too many of our parents, me included with my first set of kids, I have many sets of kids, thought it was more talent-based. And I think I probably gave those sorts of messages to my kids.
Yeah, I think that, so I guess that's good. My kids are now in the Philadelphia district. My Lower Merion friends cannot believe that we moved into the district this year, where they don't have paper. But anyway, I was like, oh, it's great, except for they have no paper, secretaries, school counselors, extracurricular activities. But I would say this, that, when I got my first report card home from the Philadelphia School District, there was a non-cognitive thing on there, citizenship. And my kids got a 1. I said, what's a 1? They said, I don't know. was like, what's citizenship? I don't know. So let me just say one thing about what, so yeah, it's in the air and you can watch people on NPR or, TED or something talk about it. But here's an idea. So Rich, you already said that, which is that maybe this is the best intervention there is, which is to measure it and give feedback to kids. And so, and that's why I was asking you right after your comments, are kids getting their score? So I'll just say this, with a bunch of charter schools and also some Catholic schools and also some district schools and some private schools, we're working on what we call the character growth card, which is the idea that, yeah, teachers are going to rate, kids and give them feedback on, and then kids are going to rate themselves, and maybe the parents can too. And then you can say, like, on this statement, which is, perseveres when something got really frustrating, this teacher gave me a 3 out of 5, this teacher gave me a 4 out of 5, like, but on Zest, on these items, I got 5 out of 5s. So basically, I think Bill Gates said very recently, and I guess I'll just stop here, that if you can measure it, you can change it. And in fact, you have to measure it if you want to change it. So I think the idea of going from citizenship 1 to very specific behavioral things that kids, I agree with you, at very young ages can totally understand, and make it specific and actionable and give them the feedback frequently enough that it implicitly sends the message that this is not a life sentence or a tattoo. This is something that you should and can change.
Okay. We want to open it up to questions from you. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll try to come to you with the microphone. All right.
I'll hold it for you. Hi, and I'm Hillary Kane from FEND. So we've talked about grit versus sort of, I guess, talent or natural ability. And yet I think there's a third thing out there that I just want to throw into this conversation and have you comment, and that's sort of circumstance. And so, people will talk about being born in a certain zip code, sort of not necessarily predestines you to certain outcomes, but, to some extent really impacts your life. And so I guess the sort of the individual factors versus the societal factors, and how does grit either impact that or vice versa?
I can speak about resilience. There's some very interesting data suggesting that if you want to get out of those circumstances, having some greater resilience will show later on in life by having higher wages. It's actually, and I can share that data with you if you like. So
resilience predicts
getting out of your socioeconomic status is to some extent predicted by your resilience. So kind of interesting, huh?
Does it correlate? I know I'm not sure I'm allowed to ask a question, but does socioeconomic class, is there a correlation around resilience and grit to socioeconomic class? Like if you've made it already and you have your kids less likely to have grit?
Oh, okay, I can repeat it if you want to just, okay. So she asked, is there a correlation between socioeconomic status and opportunity and then these individual factors like grit, resilience, or self-control? So I don't think there are enough data sets that have grit in them and SES in them, or you do. Oh, okay, go. You tell us.
That's right. No, that's what I'm just telling you.
What's the answer?
No, I'll keep it in my back pocket for now.
Oh, okay, but then okay, but with self-control, which there are bigger data sets, you do find a correlation in kids who have higher SES families do, for example, on the famous marshmallow task, like how many seconds can a 4-year-old wait for a larger preferred treat instead of one little treat right now? There is a correlation so that kids from wealthier families do tend to wait longer than kids from, lower income families, even when you control for things like how hungry they are and when they last ate, et cetera. So, I'll just say this. I don't know how to handle, I'm a psychologist, I'm not a sociologist or a policymaker, so I don't know how to handle the structural societal problems. But to Rich's point, given that, right, given your poverty level, given your mother's education, given your family structure, given all these structural things, it is also true, and I think that's why we're all here today, that the individual factors do very much determine whether you are or aren't going to change that trajectory. I'll just maybe end with that.
All right. We have a question over here.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna try to focus this.
Try to keep it to one.
Yeah, I'm wondering. Dr. Ginsburg said that the concept is additive with parents, critical without. I'm gonna try to be good. So one of my major concerns is, and I guess I'll ask it to the school district representative, if grit is such an effective non-cognitive issue or a concept, what are the implications for students who have people who are not culturally connected with them in the role as teacher and counselor and social worker? Because I think that that's an enormous understated conversation that we're having about the cultural contextualization of this conversation. I'm amazed that no one of color is involved in this conversation. And then lastly, because also at the level of measure and change, if you can't see it, you can't measure it. So there are some of us who would argue that there are actually culturally grit relevant and resilience relevant constructs that we would be able to see if we had access to the children, that you all won't measure because you don't see it because you don't have that cultural lens. So I'm just wondering if you could wrestle with those two questions for me.
So I don't actually represent the school district. I mean, I've been talking about the district, so if there's,
Microphone.
I don't actually represent the school district today on the panel, but I don't know if there's somebody from the school district here who wanted to address that issue. I think from what I hear, your issue is, you know, what impact does it have if you don't have adults in schools that understand the cultural values and significances that the kids have when they come in? Is that part of? Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I said at the beginning around what some of the causes are, I believe, for some of our negative educational outcomes is we don't have enough of that, and that we don't take, I think too often the home environment of the kids is seen as a negative as opposed to understanding that by working with parents and family that home environment can really tell us a lot about that kid and what needs to, what are the needs of that child. I don't know if I see a couple people here from the district if you want to weigh in. I don't want to speak for you.
I mean, I'll just say one thing. You know, as a psychologist, psychologists sort of study individual people. We're not sociologists, we're not anthropologists. But I've recently started a collaboration with Roland Fryer, who would self-describe himself as a big black man. I was like, are you allowed to say that? He's like, I'm allowed to say whatever I want. I was like, okay. So for those of you who don't know Roland Fryer, he's also not only a big black man, he's a full professor at Harvard in economics who had a pretty interesting life trajectory. It sort of was trending toward drug dealer in jail, and you know, he's a professor of economics at Harvard. So if that's not a testament to growth mindset and that things can change, I don't know what is. But so we've been working together on these new issues for me, like culture and race and class, which I you know, it's not part of my professional description to think about those things. And so, you know, check back with me in a couple of years because he keeps pushing me on the exact kinds of questions that you raise. And I'll just leave you with this little story. So he said to me, we have to come up with a measure of grit. That's not a questionnaire, that's a task measure, like a performance task. And I said to him, Roland, in 110 years, people have been trying to do this and nobody's been able to do it. What makes us different? And he said, you know, one of the things that makes us different is that we have our own history. Like, you know, I have a life experience. I see things through a totally different lens. It was not the same lens that, you know, Francis Galton or whoever else who tried this and failed. And he believes that actually, to your point, that we need to be more people who actually bring that first person perspective. And then, of course, all the Harvard and Princeton and Yale training and the partnerships with the schools and so forth. So, so yeah, we do need to do more work on that. And at least in the very beginnings, I'm pretty confident that, you know, we'll be able to make some progress. But, you know, call me in 2 years.
Amanda, should we take two more questions or should we wrap it up? I'm sorry. One more question. Pressure's on you.
Aaron Bass with KIP. I'm just curious. We've done a lot of work within KIP and working with Ms. Ansel Duckworth on how to assess students as far as their character strengths. My question is, who's really doing good work as far as schools that are improving students in those different areas? I know you, Dr. Richard, discussed before about how you named some schools and you're teaching towards your assessment. I can know the schools and what are they doing that we can replicate?
I mean, I can tell you that there's some incredible programs going on coming out of Yale University and also the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning in Chicago, who are now taking it in many other parts of the country. They're focusing not necessarily on grit, but more of these social and emotional learning capabilities. And I got to tell you, phenomenal stuff. There's suggestions that by infusing these things into your curricula, you can't get rid of your standard curricula, but by infusing these effective components into the curricula, you can see some very, very interesting results, not only on long-term, not on immediate educational outcomes, but on retention, and in many cases, actually, how much money the children then becoming adults make, which I think is fantastic. These are very, very committed. It's almost a way for the future.
And then I'll just say this, and I know the people in my lab are going to kill me, but we started a series called Talks for Teachers that we are running for free for what started off as 8 educators and then became 20, and now it's 50, and I keep getting like bigger and bigger rooms. But it runs on occasional Sundays, and what we do is we bring together, well, folks like you in the room, and then also, at least for me, like the best researchers and thinkers in the world on these topics, and we get together and we usually have like a TED-style talk and then a discussion and then another TED-style talk and then a discussion. So maybe that would be one way to meet other folks who are doing that. So if you're interested in that, you can email me at Duckworth. What is my email address? duckworthlab@gmail.com. I think it's duckworthlab@gmail.com, but we also have a website. And anyway, I think you will be surprised. It's not, I thought it was just all charter schools, but wow, there are these awesome Catholic schools in Camden and some really progressive independent schools. It's one place where I think you would run into more people who, again, are also involved in those networks.
Yep.
All right. Thank you all. Oh, sorry. Do you have?
I just want to add one thing, which is just that I feel like my role on the panel is just to bring us back to, and I think Angela started to go here, right, that there are assets in this community and resources in this community, and I want to go back to the second to last question, too, and thinking about what is kind of known externally and what the research says, but also what do we know locally, and who are the players who are connected to parents. You mentioned that this is a room of the usual suspects. Who are the unusual suspects? There's more and more attention being placed on the need to make sure that these various tables that we're talking about really engage not just the usual suspects, but folks who are deeply connected to communities, contextually and culturally.
All right. Thank you all so much. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, and I'm going to hand the mic back to